Previously, on One Last Kiss, after Eleanor had returned from her father's funeral, she was greeted by an unexpected guest. The woman introduced herself as Priscilla Fear, Trevor's cousin, and the one who had invited Eleanor to her winter ball. She told Eleanor that Trevor told her the news about her father. Priscilla had brought a basket of food for Eleanor, telling her that she shouldn't have to cook at a time like this. Eleanor was touched by the kindness of a stranger. As they talked, Priscilla told Eleanor that Trevor wanted to be at the funeral, but couldn't due to other business that he had to attend to. She told her that Trevor was very fond of her and spoke of her often. As they continued to talk, Priscilla began to ask Eleanor personal questions, asking her if she planned to stay in her home alone, whether or not she owned the farm, and even asked if she had enough money to live on her own. Sadly, Eleanor admitted that she had no clue where she would go or what she would do. Then Priscilla made a surprising offer. She insisted that Eleanor come and live at the Fear Manor with her and Trevor. Feeling like she had no better choice, Eleanor packed a bag of clothes, grabbed Richard's journal, and took the doll that her father had kept. As Eleanor and Priscilla rode toward Fear Manor, Eleanor sat and admired the night sky. It was the first time she ever got to truly enjoy it without fear, and for the first time in forever, she felt safe. Eventually, Eleanor saw the Fear Manor come into view, a massive 3-story structure. As they arrived, the carriage driver, Ben, carried Eleanor's bags into the house. There, she met another servant named Winslow. He took her bags and showed her to her room. Eleanor had heard that the Fears were wealthy, but she didn't realize they lived such a life of comfort. When Eleanor saw the room she would be staying in, she was shocked. The room was as big as the entire second floor of her father's house. Priscilla told Eleanor to help herself to anything in the room and to make herself at home. Eleanor was still in disbelief that it was her father's death that had brought her here. That night, when she went to bed, Eleanor believed that she could finally relax and feel safe here with Trevor and Priscilla. The next morning, Eleanor woke up feeling refreshed, and as she walked to the window, she realized that she had almost slept past noon. She quickly got out of bed and got dressed. As she walked through the halls of the manor, she ran into Winslow. She asked him if Trevor was at home. He told her yes, but said that Trevor was in his study and left strict orders to not be disturbed until evening. Then, Winslow told her that he was instructed to serve her breakfast and asked if she would return to her room. Eleanor did as he asked. Shortly after, Winslow brought Eleanor her breakfast, a plate full of bacon, eggs, biscuits, and a steaming cup of coffee. As she began to eat, Eleanor picked up Richard's journal and continued to read it. Richard still continues to feed off of woodland creatures. He still can't bring himself to feed on a human. Gwendolyn still continues to encourage feeding on humans, but Richard only wants to be what he once was, a simple man. As much as he wanted to end his life, Richard could not bring himself to do it. He still wanted to live, but he also wanted to save other people from the same fate as him. He decided that he needed to kill Gwendolyn and end her vicious cycle. That evening, Richard awoke just before Gwendolyn. He knew she slept a little longer than he did. He prepared a sharpened stake and removed the lid of her coffin. As she woke and laid eyes on Richard, he brought the stake down right into her chest. He watched as she writhed in agony. He expected it to be a quick death. But now, as he stared at her lifeless body, Richard realized he had become two things he never wanted to be, a vampire and a murderer. As Eleanor closed the journal, her attention drew back to the present. Maybe Trevor would see her now. She left her room and headed for Trevor's study. But when she entered the room, it looked as though the study had been empty all along. Eleanor decided to wait for Trevor in his study. She figured he would have to return eventually. As she waited, she wandered around the room. She took notice of an impressive library in Trevor's study. One book in particular stood out to her. She tried to pull the book out, but it seemed to be stuck. She gave a final tug on the book and it finally moved. Then Eleanor heard a soft click and watched as a small opening emerged from the bookshelves. She peered inside and saw a narrow tunnel leading underground. Eleanor grabbed a lit candle from the study and began following the tunnel. At the end, she found a tiny room with an old coffin. She made her way up to the coffin and pushed the lid aside. She was shocked to find Trevor laying peacefully in the coffin. Eleanor thought she had found Trevor dead. She thought someone had hidden his body in the secret passage. But just as she reaches out to touch Trevor, his eyes shot open and he bared his glistening white fangs at Eleanor. She finally realizes what's going on and became angry at Trevor, feeling that she had been betrayed. Trevor admits to Eleanor that he is a vampire and that Richard's journal is in fact his own. He changed his name years ago to keep people from finding out who and what he was. Frightened, Eleanor tried to escape the tiny room, but she was caught by Trevor. He held on to her long enough to get her to calm down and listen to him. Eleanor finally begins questioning him. She asked if there were other vampires. He tells her yes, there are many of his kind. Then she asked about her father's death. Trevor assures her that it was another vampire that killed her father. Eleanor then vows to find the vampire that killed her father, just as her father fought to find her mother's killer. Trevor warns her of the dangers of trying to hunt down vampires. He tells her that she is better off leaving Shadow Glen. Then he proceeds to express his feelings towards her, telling her that he has fallen in love with her and doesn't want any harm to come to her. Eleanor is caught off guard by Trevor's feelings. Finally, they both leave the hidden passage and return to the manor. Trevor tells Eleanor that he needs to go out and feed soon, but before he can leave, Priscilla enters the room. She asks Trevor if he could accompany her to a party that evening, but he tells her no and says that he must stay with Eleanor to make sure she remains protected. Priscilla senses something between Eleanor and Trevor and realizes that the two have declared their love for each other. Priscilla is thrilled at the news and proposes that her winter ball be thrown as their engagement party. Eleanor then becomes overwhelmed by everything. She tells Priscilla that she needs time to think things over. Was she really going to marry the man she loved? To marry a vampire? Chapter 18. Eleanor stood at the window in the Fear's front parlor. She watched the guests arrive for Priscilla's winter costume ball. Some arrived on foot. Others came in fancy carriages drawn by the finest horses Eleanor had ever seen. To her surprise, the guests were dressed identically. The men wore swirling black cloaks draped over crisp white shirts and black trousers. The women wore jet black gowns beneath jet black cloaks. Eleanor recognized none of them from the village. Their skin was stretched taut over pale faces. Dark circles framed their eyes, as though they never slept. Their lips were wet and glistening. Candle wax molded around their teeth gave the appearance of fangs. "Vampires," Priscilla murmured, standing beside Eleanor. "They are the latest rage in Paris. I should not have told everyone how I planned to dress. They all copied me." Eleanor peered at Priscilla and silently agreed. Priscilla wore a striking white gown. Over it, she wore a billowing black cape. The inside was lined with deep red velvet. Her blonde hair fell wildly around her shoulders. Ashes from the fireplace made dark smudges beneath her eyes. "Do you believe vampires exist?" Eleanor asked hesitantly. "Of course not," Priscilla answered. "Have you seen Trevor?" Eleanor glanced around. Night had fallen. Trevor would be awake now. "No. He probably won't come," Priscilla said with a sigh. "Trevor is such a loner. He dislikes parties, but he indulges me when I come to visit." Eleanor watched Priscilla stroll away. She did not blame Trevor for avoiding the party. A shiver ran along her spine as she watched Priscilla greet her guests. It was a strange party, Eleanor thought, for celebrating one's betrothal. Then again, she was hardly in the party spirit. She wasn't wearing a costume. Since she still mourned her father's death, she wore a simple black dress. Just last week, she had wanted nothing more than to attend this party. Now she wished that particular dream had not come true. The fact was, she was only here because her father was dead. In the huge front parlor, candles shimmered on the crystal chandeliers, casting a pale glow over the room. Shadows quivered in the corners. Eleanor went over to the table where a large bowl contained a dark brew. She slipped the silver dipper beneath the surface, filled it with liquid, and poured the deep red drink into a goblet. She brought it to her lips. It carried a strong odor, reminding her of the butcher's shop where the scent of fresh blood hung heavy in the air. Eleanor's stomach heaved. She pressed a hand to her mouth and swallowed hard. The liquid burned. With a trembling hand, she placed the goblet on the table. It was still half full. "Aren't you going to drink that?" a deep voice asked. Taking a breath, she spun around. A tall man stood before her. His dark hair fell past his shoulders. His intense gaze bore into her. "No," she whispered hoarsely, her throat still burning. "I'm not thirsty." He lifted the goblet and downed the vile drink in one long swallow. Then he licked his lips, his eyes latching onto hers. "Aren't you the girl Trevor is going to marry?" he asked. She nodded and forced a smile. "Priscilla did not tell us you were so lovely," the man went on. "Trevor is very lucky. Perhaps you can convince him to become more social." His smile revealed two pointed fangs. "Trevor is very busy," Eleanor murmured. She was not at all certain that she wanted him to be friendly with this group. "Yes, I understand he spends a good deal of time hunting. I am a hunter myself. The sport is in tracking your prey and striking when the attack is least expected. There is nothing like the look of terror and doom in the eyes of the hunted. They always know when they are about to die." Tendrils of unease wound their way around Eleanor. She didn't care for the direction the conversation was going. She wanted to change the subject. "Is this your first party?" she asked. "Oh no," he assured her. "I have been to many, but tonight the guests are particularly interesting." "Priscilla says vampires are all the rage in Paris," Eleanor told him. His gaze darkened. "Indeed, everyone is talking about them. Did you know that when a vampire falls in love, he will seek out a victim with a strong heart and tear the heart from the victim's chest? He'll roast the still-beating heart over a low fire until it shrivels and darkens. Then he'll feed it to his love, and she will be his forever." Eleanor felt her stomach churning. "Where did you hear such a horrid story?" she demanded. "From a vampire, of course." Then he threw his head back, and his deep laughter echoed around the room. Eleanor felt the room swirling around her, the nausea growing stronger. She could no longer take the odor of blood, the hideous laughter. She turned on her heel and pushed her way through the crowd. She had to escape. She opened the double doors that led to the balcony. She went to the railing and bent over, breathing heavily, drawing the clean, frigid air deep into her lungs. "Eleanor?" She swirled around. Trevor emerged from the shadows. He slipped his cloak over her shoulders. "What are you doing out here in the cold?" he asked. "The party isn't at all what I expected. I just needed to get away for a while," she confessed. He nodded. "Priscilla's friends are different. Do you agree? They seem to think pretending to be a vampire is exciting." She touched his cheek. "If only they knew the truth." "One good thing has come from my being a vampire," he said solemnly. "And what is that?" she asked. She wondered how he could find anything good in all that he had to endure. "If I weren't a vampire, I would have died from old age long ago, and I never would have known you," he replied quietly. Tears stung her eyes at his admission. He held a flower toward her, a crimson rose. Her eyes widened in wonder. "Where did you get such a lovely flower?" He shrugged slightly. "I found it near the stables earlier. Somehow it survived the coming of winter. He shifted his gaze away from her. "I will never be able to walk with you through a garden while the sun is shining." A slow, eerie waltz drifted out of the front parlor onto the balcony. "Dance with me," he said quietly. He took her hand and led her into the ballroom. He slipped his cloak from her shoulders and draped it over a chair. Then he took Eleanor into his arms. They glided across the dance floor. Her skirt rustled as they circled the room. She imagined years of dancing in Trevor's arms, years of growing old, wrinkled and bent, while he remained young. The music drifted into silence. Eleanor's heart pounded as Trevor held her close. The candles flickered over his face. His dark eyes reflected the flames. How she wished they were alone. How she wished he would kiss her. He bowed slightly. "I must go," he said, his voice low. "Where?" He leaned toward her, pressing his lips against her ear. Chills cascaded through her. "I must hunt," he murmured with regret. Abruptly, he straightened and strode from the room. She watched him leave. Eleanor suddenly felt an odd sensation. It was as though icy fingers walked along her bare spine. Her gaze darted around the room. She froze when she saw the man who told her the horrid story of cooking hearts. He stood beside the hearth, talking to Priscilla, but his gaze was focused on Eleanor. She did not like the way he stared at her. Averting his gaze, she walked as calmly as she could across the room. She could feel the man's gaze following her like a shadow. She felt everyone watching her, studying her. These people were Priscilla's friends, but Eleanor thought they would never be hers. Annie was her friend. How she wished Annie were here. The sensation of being watched intensified. Eleanor glanced over her shoulder. The man left Priscilla's side and began to walk toward her. Eleanor stepped quickly into the foyer. Her foot caught on something. She stumbled and fell forward. Her hand sank into something warm and mushy. She stared in horror at Ben's face. The young driver's mouth hung open. His eyes rolled back into his head, so all she could see were the whites of his eyes. She struggled to sit up. Her hand slid forward and was sucked farther into the gaping, bloody hole in Ben's chest, into a chest that no longer had a heart. Chapter 19. Eleanor's horrified scream echoed through the foyer. She wrenched her hand from Ben's still warm body. Glistening blood dripped from her fingertips like scarlet tears. She screamed again. She started to edge away, but her slick, bloodied hand slid across the stone floor. Jarring pain shot through her elbow as it slammed against the floor. She heard hurried footsteps, startled gasps. Eleanor glanced over her shoulder. The guests were staring at Ben's mutilated body. Then they began to close in on her, their fangs bared, their eyes glittering, reflecting the flames of the candles. Closer and closer, blocking the door, preventing her escape. Air. Eleanor could find no air to breathe. She felt the frantic beat of her pulse at her throat. She heard a roaring in her ears. The black cape spread around her, shutting out the light, encasing her in darkness. They were coming for her, the blood of other victims staining their teeth. Everything began to spin around her. Darkness edged her vision. She felt Ben's blood congeal between her fingers. Then she heard rapid footsteps and a low, furious voice. The crowd parted, and Trevor knelt beside her. "Eleanor," he said, wrapping his arms around her. "What is going on here?" Priscilla's voice demanded. Eleanor peered over Trevor's shoulder and saw Priscilla forcing her way through the crowd. Priscilla's eyes locked on the young driver. She staggered back, pressing her hand to her mouth. "Oh, poor Ben," she murmured. Then she rushed forward and fell to her knees beside Eleanor. She took Eleanor's blood-stained hand. "My dear, you're hurt." Eleanor shook her head wildly. No, I fell into him." She turned her face into Trevor's chest, trying to block out the sight of what she'd seen. Tears scalded her eyes. "Someone tore out his heart." She felt Trevor stiffen against her. Gently, he pushed her away from him. She felt Priscilla's arm come around her. She watched Trevor stand. Anger shimmered around him as he faced his guests. "This is my home," he said in a low, menacing voice. "My sanctuary. Your games of playing vampire have gone too far. I want you out. I want you all out, now." "My cousin is right," Priscilla said in a voice that fairly shook with fury. "We welcomed you with open arms, and you repay us with a senseless death." She pointed a slender finger toward the door. "Leave, now." Murmuring and muttering, the guests scurried out. The door slammed in their wake, leaving a deathly silence in the air. Priscilla helped Eleanor to her feet. She led her into the front parlor and sat her in a chair before the fire. Only a moment passed before Trevor knelt before her and tenderly washed Ben's blood from her hand with a damp cloth. She could see the strain and anger in the hard planes of his face. "Do you know who did this?" he snapped. Eleanor shook her head. "No, I didn't see anything." He gave her a small smile. "I was not talking to you." He shifted his dark eyes to Priscilla, who was pacing back and forth. "Do you know who killed Ben?" Eleanor watched Priscilla come to a sudden stop. "No, but it sickens me. I cannot believe one of my friends would do such a thing." "I thought Eleanor would be safe here," Trevor said. Eleanor's heart tightened. He took her hand, the one still clutching the flower he gave her earlier. He kissed her hand, then said, "I will die before I let anyone harm you." "No one is going to harm her," Priscilla said. She saw anger in Trevor's eyes. "She cannot stay here. Someone killed Ben. What guarantee do you have that the same monster won't try to kill her?" "No one is going to harm Eleanor. I will handle the matter. Whoever ripped out Ben's heart will pay with his own. I swear it." Much later, when exhaustion overtook her, Eleanor started toward her bedroom. Priscilla had gone into town to talk with the magistrate. Trevor was seeing to Ben's body. Even though Trevor had thoroughly washed her hand, she felt as though Ben's blood coated her skin. She rubbed her palm repeatedly over the black wool skirt, but she could still feel the sleekness of warm, fresh blood. Her stomach lurched. Eleanor walked past Trevor's room. The door stood ajar. She wondered if he ever slept here, or if he only kept his clothes in the room. As much as she knew about him, it seemed Eleanor had much more to learn. She peered inside. The room was shadowy and empty. As she turned to leave, she saw a flash of white lying in a heap beside the bed. A shirt, she realized, walking into the room. It looked as though he had taken it off and thrown it aside in haste. Bending, she picked it up from the floor. It was damp, wet. An acrid, rusty odor assaulted her nostrils. She jerked her head back to avoid the offensive odor. She turned the shirt in her hand, her gaze falling on a dark stain. Her heart thundered, and her breath came in small gasps. She walked to the door where the hallway candles cast their pale glow. She stared at the bright red stain. Blood. An enormous amount of blood soaked the shirt. She swayed as the possibilities assailed her. Trevor came to the party late. Could he have killed Ben and changed shirts first? What if he had wanted Ben's heart to bind her to him? It was possible. After all, everyone was in the front parlor by then, no one in the foyer. Or had he killed Ben when he left her after their dance? Her fingers grew cold as she clutched the shirt. Trevor was right. She wasn't safe here. She tossed the shirt to the floor and hurried out of his room. She didn't know what to believe any longer. Vampires existed. Trevor admitted to her he needed blood. Did they also need a human heart? She rushed into her room and closed the door. She needed time to think, to make a plan. She walked to the window, pulled the curtain back, and gazed out at the bleak winter landscape. What should I do, she wondered. I'm a fool to think I was safe here. Trevor was at our house the night my father was murdered. He left me, and moments later I heard Father scream. Tonight Ben is killed, and I discover fresh blood on Trevor's shirt. A movement near the base of the trees caught her attention. She peered more closely through the paned glass. She could barely see the outline of a cloaked figure moving swiftly through the shadows. Was it Trevor? Would he kill a man to quench his craving for blood? After all, he admitted to murdering Gwendolyn. She had to know if she had fallen in love with a murderer. She grabbed her cloak, draped it over her shoulders, and hurried down the stairs. She ran toward the woods, the cold night air circling her, reaching for her through the bare branches. Moonlight shimmered over frozen ground. Here and there, thin patches of ice crunched beneath her feet. Where is he? Eleanor wondered. Where is Trevor? She slowed her pace. Ahead of her, someone was walking with long, swift strides. He moved with surety and purpose, like a cat stalking. He was a predator, hunting for his prey. A high-pitched shriek suddenly pierced the air. Eleanor broke into a run. She dashed into a clearing and stumbled to a stop. Hot, burning bile rose into her throat. Her body froze with muted horror, paralyzing her, giving her no choice but to watch. Trevor fell to his knees and sank his fangs into his victim's delicate throat. Chapter 20. Eleanor watched, horrified. Trevor's prey writhed within his hands, legs kicking frantically. She heard the slurping sound as Trevor drained the blood from his victim's body. Then all grew still. Trevor did not move, nor did his victim. Long moments passed, and Eleanor could do no more than watch. Her legs felt as though they had turned to jelly. With one swift movement, as though suddenly sensing her presence, Trevor turned. His red glowing eyes stared at her. Glistening blood trailed down from the corners of his mouth. Slowly, he rose to his feet and tossed his latest victim, a wood rat, aside. With a purpose, he stalked toward Eleanor, hunger in his eyes. He growled low in his throat. Eleanor willed herself to run, but her body was paralyzed with sheer terror. Trevor advanced, and then he was towering over her. "I'm sorry, Eleanor," he said, "but I have no choice. I must have blood." Eleanor scrambled back. She felt her own blood pounding at her temples. She saw the blood on Trevor's face glistening in the moonlight. Her fingers touched something hard and rough. A branch, a fallen tree branch, pointed on the end, wooden. Would it serve as a stake? She wondered frantically. Could she bring herself to kill him if it came down to a choice, his life or hers? Holding the branch like a club, she swung it in front of her. "Stay back!" she cried. "I won't let you feed on me." "I must have blood," Trevor ground out through clenched teeth. "Human blood, or blood from a vile creature." He glanced back at his victim. The wood rat lay perfectly still and dead. "And now you need more?" Eleanor asked him. Trevor bowed his head. "I hate what I am." He turned to walk away. "Trevor?" she called, her voice trembling. With bleakness in his eyes, he glanced back at her. "You thought I would take your blood," he stated. She nodded her head. "I found fresh blood on a shirt in your room. I was afraid you killed Ben." He shut his eyes and slowly shook his head. "Oh, Eleanor." "You are a vampire," she cried. She tried to calm the hysteria in her voice. "I am trying to understand, but I'm frightened because I don't truly know what that means, what you are capable of doing," she admitted. He opened his eyes. They glittered with unshed tears. "I love you, Eleanor. Do you know what that means?" Her fingers unfurled from around the branch, and it fell to the ground. Suddenly, his arms were around her, holding her tightly. I only tasted a few drops of human blood the night I watched my kind devour a man, he said somberly. Tears welled in her eyes and burned. The miller, she whispered hoarsely. Yes. Tonight, someone told me that vampires roasted hearts. He touched his gloved finger to her lips. You must learn to trust me. So much easier said than done. Still, she gave him a shaky nod. The cold wind whipped through the woods, and a light snow began to fall. I need to get you home, Trevor said. You shouldn't be wandering the woods at night. Reaching out, he took her hand. She wished he weren't wearing gloves so she could feel his skin against hers, but she knew his hand would be colder than the winter night. As they neared the house, she saw a pale light in her bedroom window. No other lights were lit. The great manor house looked dark and lonely. Trevor led Eleanor around to the back of the house. There, he opened the door and ushered her into the kitchen. The glowing embers from the open brick oven cast a dim glow over the room. He gave her a warning glare. Stay inside. No one will dare bother you here. He started to close the door. She grabbed it, stopping him. Where will you be? Hunting, he replied solemnly. Because I will not drink human blood. I require more animal blood to maintain my strength. She watched him walk away into the night. She knew that no matter what he was, she loved him. She walked past the oven. Something caught her eye. She backed up and peered into the oven. She saw an object resting on the coals, shriveled, blackened, charred. A lump of flesh. A human heart. Chapter 21. Eleanor did not sleep all that night. She loved Trevor, but she also feared him. She did not feel safe in his house, or anywhere in Shadow Glen. Her revenge against her father's killer would wait. The events of the night before had left her shaken, confused. Could she love a man and still not trust him? I have got to leave this place, she thought, and I have got to do it without telling Trevor. She needed time to think, to try and make sense of it all. She could not risk his coming after her. The next morning, Eleanor sat in her room and made plans. She would say goodbye to Annie. Next, she would return to her father's house and gather a few belongings. Then she would cross the bridge over the river and set off for the nearest village, and try to forget the man she loved. That afternoon, Eleanor trudged through the thick blanket of snow toward town. The harsh winter winds whipped around her. Her feet and hands went numb minutes after she left Fear Manor. Tiny flakes of snow stung her cheeks and clung to her eyelashes. She neared the town. The streets were deserted, except for a skinny dog scrounging for scraps of meat. She approached the cobbler's shop and went around to the back. She knocked briskly on Mr. Dobbin's kitchen door. No one answered. She stomped her cold feet, trying to warm them. She knocked again. The door was flung open. Eleanor staggered back. Dobbin stood in the doorway, his eyes blazing with anger. "What do you want?" he demanded. "I want to speak with Annie," she told him. He spit in the snow at her feet. "Annie? Annie Muldoon ran away." He started to close the door. Eleanor slammed her palm against it, stopping his actions. "What are you talking about?" she asked. "Annie agreed to work for me for 7 years. Yesterday I get up and find the lazy brat is gone," he muttered. Eleanor shook her head. "She wouldn't run away." "Then where is she?" he yelled. "I don't know, but I do know she wouldn't run away. When did you last see her?" "Night before last. She fixed me a cup of warm milk so I could sleep. Then yesterday morning I woke up and she was gone. Left the door here open in the middle of the storm, so now I've got snow in my kitchen and the house is freezing." "Annie didn't run away," Eleanor insisted. She had a bad feeling about this, a terrible feeling. Something must have happened to her. The shoemaker grunted. "Well, when you find her, you tell her that she owes me 6 more years of service." He slammed the door closed. Eleanor stared at the wooden door. Something dreadful had happened to Annie. She could feel it in her bones. An icy chill ran through her that had nothing to do with the bitter weather. What had happened to Annie? Dobbin said the door was left open. Where had Annie gone in the middle of a storm? Eleanor glanced around. The thick blanket of snow revealed no tracks. Had Annie wandered outside and gotten lost? Drawing her cloak more tightly around her, Eleanor made her way to the butcher's shop. Mr. Hamill hadn't seen Annie, nor had the baker. Eleanor stopped at every house and shop in the village. Dusk began to settle in. Eleanor continued her search. A crescent moon rose high in the sky. Eleanor borrowed a lantern from the blacksmith. Then she made her way to the end of town. Although the leaves had long ago fallen to the ground, the woods looked thick and menacing. The branches danced wildly in the wind. It was dark now, and Eleanor longed for the warmth of a fire, but she had to find Annie. She headed into the woods. The ground crunched beneath her feet. The moonlight darted in and out between the huge trees. The lantern rocked in her hand. It cast a golden, wavering light on the snow. "Annie?" she cried, but no one answered. Thick, heavy flakes of snow began to fall. Eleanor shivered violently. Her hands and feet ached from the cold, but she wouldn't give up. She neared the river. The moonlight revealed huge chunks of ice bobbing lazily in the water. Eleanor walked to the river bank. The winds were colder here. Her hands were growing numb. Her eyes burned as she spotted the bridge. Holding the lantern out to guide her, she carefully stepped onto the stone arch that spanned the river. The ice was more abundant here, bobbing up and down beneath the bridge, dark and shadowy. The light from the lantern touched a long block of ice. It did not bob as much as the others, but seemed to hug the bank. Her heart pounding, Eleanor crept beneath the bridge. She held the lantern higher. Within the partially frozen waters beneath the bridge, she could make out the shape more clearly. A body. She could see long red hair trapped within the ice, in a calico dress. Eleanor dropped to her knees. She set the lantern beside her. With aching fingers, she grabbed a rock and began slamming it against the ice. Small chips fell off, but the woman inside the ice was still trapped. Eleanor had to get her out, had to know who the woman was. "Please don't be Annie," she sobbed as she pounded the rock onto the ice. She heard a near-splitting crack and watched a tiny fissure run the length of the ice. Wind blew beneath the bridge, screeching with fury. Strong hands clamped down on Eleanor's shoulder. "You will die." Chapter 22. Eleanor spun around, ready to slam the rock against her attacker. Trevor stood before her, his eyes blazing with fury. "You will die if you stay out in this storm," he yelled. Eleanor dropped her arm to her side. "There's a woman trapped in the ice." Trevor glanced down at the embankment. "Leave her. She's dead." "I have to know who it is," Eleanor cried. "My friend Annie disappeared." "You have to get inside before you freeze to death," he yelled above the roaring winds. "I won't leave until I know who this woman is," she insisted. "Stubborn girl," Trevor muttered. He knelt beside her and grabbed a rock. Together they pounded on the ice. More chips fell away until the woman was free of most of the ice. Trevor pulled her frozen body from the edge of the river. He rolled the woman over. Eleanor's heart tightened as she looked at Annie. She touched Annie's pale face. Her eyes were closed. She looked as though she were sleeping. "Is that your friend?" Trevor asked. Eleanor nodded mutely. "I'll send someone to fetch her," Trevor said. Eleanor shook her head fiercely. "I won't leave her." Trevor grabbed her arm. "You are turning into ice yourself. Do you want to catch your death?" "I won't leave her out here," she insisted. He spit out an oath. Eleanor watched as he slipped his arms beneath Annie's stiff body. He lifted her as though she were a plank of wood. "Grab the lantern. There is a cottage near here," he ordered. Gratefully, she grabbed the lantern with numb fingers. Trevor walked swiftly over the frozen ground. Eleanor had to scramble to keep up. He didn't even feel the stinging wind and snow, she realized. Still, it seemed they walked through the storm for hours before she saw a dark shadow in the distance. It was a small, run-down cottage. Trevor strode toward it and kicked the door in. Eleanor rushed in behind him. She watched Trevor set Annie on the floor by the hearth. Then he crossed the room and slammed the door shut. Eleanor set the lantern on a scarred table, stirring up a thin film of dust. Spider webs dangled in the corners and across the ceiling beams. Trevor knelt before the hearth. Eleanor heard a rustle and a snap. She saw a tiny flame spark to life. Then the flames grew, lapping greedily at the logs Trevor fed it. On stiff legs, Eleanor approached the warmth. "You are insane," Trevor said. He untied her damp cape and removed it. Then he began to rub her hands between his. A shiver raced up her spine. It was the first time he had touched her without gloves. His hands were as icy as Annie's. "I wish my hands were warm," he muttered as though he had read her thoughts. "Here, get closer to the fire." She knelt before the hearth. and then felt something heavy and warm fall across her shoulders. Trevor's fur-lined cloak. She drew it closer and looked at him with gratitude. The warmth from the fire seeped through to her core. The musty odor of the cottage filled her nostrils. She stared at the bright orange and red flames that danced within the hearth. The hairs on the nape of her neck bristled. She slid her gaze to Trevor. He was studying her neck with a fierce intensity. She pressed her hand to her throat. She felt her pulse thrumming against her fingers. He pressed his lips against hers. For a fleeting moment, Eleanor thought she felt warmth beneath the surface of his skin. He drew back. She saw the bleakness had returned to his eyes. "I must get you home," he murmured. "I'll go to the house and send someone with a sleigh." She glanced toward the rattling windows. "But the storm is so fierce." He gave her a weary smile. "It won't kill me." "But it might slow you down. How much longer until dawn?" she asked. He stood and walked to the window. He pulled a worn, frayed curtain aside and glanced out. Eleanor rose to her feet and joined him. "Dawn will be here soon," he said quietly. She touched her hand to his arm. "Don't go. There is not enough wood to last until the coming night. The cold can kill you. It can't harm me." He held up a finger and stated firmly, "Stay here until I send someone for you. Keep the bar over the door, and do not open the door to anyone before dawn." "There are others, of your kind, out there?" she said unsteadily. "Yes, so you must promise me you won't open the door before dawn." "I promise," she told him. She followed him as he walked to the door. He lifted the bar, opened the door slightly, and slipped out into the storm. Eleanor pushed the door closed and dropped the bar into place. She hurried to the window, but she could not see Trevor. The wind swirled the thick snow across the land. The black sky was visible through the bare branches. How long before it would turn blue? Before the sun touched the sky? With a sigh, Eleanor returned to the fire. The flames crackled and popped, the only sound within the old cottage. She sat on the hardwood floor. Annie was dead. Sweet Annie, who had traveled so far. Eleanor tried not to panic as it suddenly occurred to her that she was locked in a cottage with a corpse. "Don't be silly," she chided herself. "It's only Annie." But sitting vigil with Annie's dead body unnerved her. She felt a chill as something cold touched her leg. Cold and wet. She flinched and glanced down. A pool of water spread across the floor. The thin layer of remaining ice that had surrounded Annie had begun to thaw. Eleanor shifted her body. She forced herself not to be frightened. She made herself picture Annie when she was alive, laughing. "How did you die, Annie?" she wondered. "Did you get lost in the woods and fall into the river?" Annie had been the best friend she'd ever had. Eleanor leaned forward. Gently, she combed the tangled mess of Annie's red hair back from her face. Drops of water slid along Annie's cheeks, like frozen tears that had thawed. Eleanor moved Annie's hair aside and glanced at her neck. Twin bruises marred her flesh. Within the center of each was a large puncture wound. She pressed her fingers to the horrid wounds. Bright red blood oozed out and slid along Annie's throat. Suddenly, Annie's eyes flew open. Eleanor gasped in surprise. "Annie?" she cried. Annie dug her fingers into Eleanor's arm. She opened her mouth wide. Sharp pointed fangs glistened. "I must feed," Annie growled. She lunged for Eleanor's throat.